targets, who's striking at right targets, who's striking at wrong targets. We've been proposing on many occasions to deal with this issue professionally now, having the agreement that the task force will determine areas taken by Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. We have made a very important practical step forward in this direction. I would also like to underscore that for the first time in our work, the document that we have adopted today stipulates the need to cooperate and coordinate not only political and humanitarian issues, but also the military dimension of the Syrian crisis. This is a qualitatively new change in the approaches, and we welcome it. We've been calling for it. Another important thing is the clear confirmation in today's document of the need to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions which require to stop flows of terrorists and fighters from foreign states, to stop illicit trade in oil and other smuggling. This is an important reminder because UN Security Council resolutions must be implemented in full. It has also been underscored the task to resume the negotiation process that was suspended against the backdrop when a part of the opposition took an non-constructive stance and tried to put preconditions. We have written down that talks should resume as soon as possible in strict compliance with the resolution 2254, that is without any ultimatums, without any preconditions, and talks should include a wide range of opposition forces. As you know, not all of real members of the opposition, some groups of the Syrian population have received an invitation to these talks. I believe that the UN will, as we have confirmed today, be strictly guided by principles stipulated by the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The last thing I wanted to say is to support what John concluded his speech by, that the real test of our efforts will be our ability to respect our commitments and to implement what we have agreed upon. This is unfortunately a problem that arises not only in the context of the Syrian crisis. We face the impossibility, the failure to negotiate of many of our partners. I have already mentioned the attempts to misinterpret the resolution 2254. We've been facing similar approaches when we are looking at how UN Security Council resolutions are being implemented that set forth a package of measures to settle the Ukrainian crisis. And I'm not going to mention the issue of Palestine. We have to learn not to simply reach a compromise, but also to implement the agreements which are set forth in such compromise solutions. When attempts have been made to achieve agreements, when we start looking for reasons which justify the failure to implement decisions that had been taken, this does not benefit the cause. And let me repeat that I totally agree with John that the real test will be how we will implement what we have agreed upon today in full, not only in some components that are convenient for one group of participants, of members of the International Syria Support Group. We have also today agreed that our group will continue the Vienna process. The number of problems is not on the decrease if we manage to achieve progress in those areas that we have agreed upon today. I think it will help us deal with other issues arising from Resolution 2254. Thank you.
Sergei, thank you very much. Stefan.
Thank you very much. When we were convening and we had the beginning of the Geneva intra-Syrian talks, we were flooded with messages from the Syrian people. They were coming from all over, outside and inside Syria, and they were asking two things, actually three. The first one was, please don't have another conference as the others, and don't have just a conference about talking about talks, but please give us two things. One is humanitarian access. We are human beings. We deserve to get food, water, access to medical facilities. And second, we need no more bombs, no more war. If you succeed in giving us that message, we will believe in you when you convene and reconvene the talks. I think that today the ISSG, which was actually convened in order to be able to give new energy to the future talks, has addressed that. Of course, that will be tested. Now, there are two aspects you heard. One is the humanitarian one. You can see here, and you have a list, and you will see it everywhere now. This is the list of the areas and the people who are in need, and the numbers of them. Now, the ISSG has told the UN, you are in charge in launching this initiative with our support. We are going to do it tomorrow. We will have the first task force of ISSG, which means it's not meeting every 2 months. Now there is having a constant convening possibility in order to test 7 locations. One of them, Deir ez-Zor, which can only be reached by airdropping, others which have never been reached before. We will test it very soon, Monday, Tuesday, not later, and see whether in fact we will have problems, as we often have had, in order to reach places. If that is the case, we go back to you again. And we will go back to the ISSG and say, we are needing help in order to make it happen. The other area, of course, is the one you heard about cessation of hostilities. Not ceasefire, we're talking about cessation of hostility, which is easier in a way and much more effective in a way, because it requires just a decision. That is quite a challenge for doing it in such a short period, but that's exactly what people are asking. And we will be, of course, assisting, but that is something that the two convener countries are going to be committing themselves to make it happen. What I can say is that this is a good testing time. Are the Syrian people going to see these outcomes? Then they will believe in future conferences and they believe in their own future. And the ISSG has shown that they are ready to commit themselves. One point that probably we noticed, many had wondered whether there was tensions in the region that would not allow some countries perhaps to be part of it or not wanting to be part of it. We were able today to witness exactly the contrary. Saudi Arabia was there, Iran was there, everyone was there, and they were there determined to spend hours in order to discuss it. So, thank you.
Stefan, thank you very much.
We'll take 3 questions tonight. The first one from David Sanger, New York Times.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First, a definitional issue. If any of you could just tell us a little more about how a ceasefire differs from the cessation of hostilities, I think we'd be appreciative. Mr. Secretary, the Russian airstrikes in the past few weeks, as you've mentioned, have strengthened President Assad and his allies. It's given them virtual control of Aleppo for the first time in 4 years. So if this cessation of hostilities and ultimately a ceasefire works, aren't you essentially freezing a situation that effectively gives Mr. Assad a good-sized rump Syrian state, years after President Obama said that he had to leave office? And Mr. Lavrov, could you address the humanitarian agencies who are all saying that your airstrikes are killing civilians each day, and yet your own government saying that they are not. Are the humanitarian agencies lying about this?
So, a ceasefire has a great many legal prerogatives and requirements. A cessation of hostilities is not anticipated to, but in many ways they have a similar effect. A ceasefire, in the minds of many of the participants in this particular moment, connotes something far more permanent and far more reflective of sort of an end of conflict, if you will. And it is distinctly not that. This is a pause that is dependent on the process going forward, and therefore cessation of hostilities is a much more appropriate, apt term. But the effect of ending hostile actions, the effect of ending offensive actions and permitting only defensive actions that are a matter of self-defense is the same in that regard. I might comment also, and I think this is very important for everybody to understand. During this week, the Assad regime and the opposition need to make their decision. And both are going to be engaged in consultations. The International Syria Support Group took a different step this time from what has happened previously. In Vienna on 2 occasions and in New York, we called for a ceasefire. We encouraged people. Today, we specifically decided on a process, on a time frame, and we all agreed to do everything that we can to meet that. So the ISSG is engaged actively in the implementation process of this ceasefire through 2 task forces, one working on the humanitarian delivery, the other working directly on the modalities of the cessation of hostilities. And we will work on that. Sergei and I are chairing the ceasefire component. The ceasefire ultimately, not at this moment, but the objective is to achieve a durable, long-term ceasefire at some point in time. Now, that will only become possible if the parties themselves engage at the table in a genuine negotiation to implement what we have once again embraced, which is the Geneva process, the Geneva communique that calls for a transition by mutual consent with full executive authority. Now, look, we're doing everything in the power of diplomacy to try to bring an end to this conflict in a way that results in a unified, non-sectarian, minority-protecting, secular whole state. That's a complicated task. And there are many different cross-currents underneath this that make it complicated. But we're convinced that that's the only way that Syria really survives and can flourish again, and that you can make peace. Obviously, there is a difference, which has to be worked out in the context of the negotiations regarding the future of Assad. And you have to be at the table to deal with that. It doesn't do any good for me to sit here, or Sergei or other people to, go on and on about what he has or hasn't done. In the end, that's got to be resolved in the context of the negotiation or through some other leverage. With respect to freezing the current situation, if you will, in this sort of rump state, I disagree completely. Yes, it is true that the bombing of the last weeks and the aggressive actions of the Assad regime, together with the forces from other places and countries that have helped them, has made a difference for Assad. There is no question about that. But that difference doesn't end the war. that difference does not mean that Assad is secure or safe for the long term. It does not mean that Syria is free from the scourge of terrorist activity by Daesh and others, al-Nusra and others. And it does not mean that the war is able to end at any time in the foreseeable future. So while, yes, there are some advantages, they are not advantages that turn this on its ear. This is still a very complicated conflict with long-term implications, with increasing levels of violence, with increasing numbers of refugees, with increasing numbers of terrorists. And it is our belief that the more successful Assad is in securing territory against the opposition, the more successful he is in creating more terrorists who threaten the region. So we have a fundamental task ahead of us, which hopefully this process can shed some light on, as to how we are going to be able to resolve the conflict of one war, which is the war against Assad, and also resolve the other war, which is the war against the terrorists, and particularly Daesh. No small undertaking, but very much front and center in all of our thinking and in the political process that we are trying to create to find a peaceful resolution.
Что касается вопроса адресов...
As for the question that you've asked me, the difference between ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, Resolution 2254 talks about the ceasefire only. This term is not liked by some members of the International Syria Support Group. What I'm referring to is how something that has been agreed upon should be implemented, rather than try to remake the consensus that has been achieved in order to get some unilateral advantages. We have agreed to this because it is said clearly that this is the first step towards a ceasefire. John has explained that there isn't much difference, actually, but this play in words is the same thing as statements about the existence of some kind of plan B, statements that ground forces should be prepared. This is a slippery road. They say that it is necessary to defeat ISIL, but there is no doubt that this will only lead to the aggravation of the conflict. Moreover, given that many countries, especially the US, have the so-called Assad issue, and this Assad issue is still in the center of their attention, although we've said clearly in the UN Security Council resolution and repeated today that only the Syrian people themselves will decide the fate of Syria. And the political process should be carried out on the basis of mutual consent of the government and the whole range of opposition. We've said a lot about Aleppo today, and we've heard accusations against Russia, which I'm not going to repeat. We hear them on a daily basis. You've mentioned some kind of humanitarian agencies, which, as you've said, keep saying every day that Russia kills civilians. I did not hear such statements from humanitarian agencies of the UN. That is why I cannot say that they are lying, but some do lie. I know that the well-respected media, I'm afraid that I might make a mistake. I believe this is a British media that took an interview from Ban Ki-moon and published this interview with unscrupulous versions of what is said. He never mentioned Russia. He just called for the end of any actions that lead to sufferings of civilians. The interviewer allowed himself to put into the mouth of the UN Secretary General the statements that he was saying all those things about Russia. So yes, they are lies, but these are not the humanitarian agencies that are lying. We are cooperating with humanitarian agencies, and they, by the way, if you talk to them, and if they are not put under pressure, they will acknowledge that cooperation in dealing with humanitarian issues from government is much more constructive than that from the side of opposition. Well, you see, many are simply trying now to not to create the impression that they are beyond the mainstream that is now being created in media, trying to distract attention from what is the important for all of us. And the most important for all of us is to prevent ISIL from implementing its criminal plans. And they're trying to limit it by the change of regime, as if Iraq and Libya had never existed. The case of Iraq and Libya had never existed. Some still have illusions that if we change the regime, everything will be fine. As for Aleppo, John said that he is worried by recent aggressive actions of the government. Well, if liberation of the city that has been taken by illegal armed groups can be qualified as aggression, then, well, yeah, probably. But to attack those who have taken your land is necessary,